In today's lecture, I'm going to give you a brief overview of how to read wine labels and how they differ from the wine labels that we use in America and a lot of other parts of the world, like South America and New Zealand, Australia, and how they differ from the wine labels in Europe. Now, remember, this is quite extensive, but we're going to give you just a very, very quick overview here. Okay, so the wine labels that we use in North America, and probably ones that you guys are most often familiar with seeing in the wine store. So overall, we use typically three types of wine labels in the US. They are usually generic, proprietary, or we highlight the varietal. So we'll kind of go into each of these individuals and I'll give you examples of how and where you might find these. This is very different from the European way of labeling and quite, the North American labels and what we use, they're actually they're way more easier to read and to understand than the European ones. All right, so let's get started with the generic labels. So as you can imagine with the word generic, most of the time we are referring to a lower end a type of wine when we talk about the generic labels. So this is typically, you would find these on what we call jug wines or box wines. And as you might imagine, I am not a fan of these wines. Every single time somebody's drinking wine out of a box, I just want you guys to look at this picture right here. This is what's inside of it. And after knowing how much care and expertise it takes to create a really, really good wine, you would imagine that somebody that really puts that much effort into it, and if it's a really high quality product, they would never put it into a plastic bag and then into a cardboard box, right? So now you can imagine why I'm not such a fan of it. But basically, generic of wines and wine labeling has to do with the fact that the wine is not that high quality. And basically it is named by typically a region, okay, in France, but it actually has nothing to do at all with that type of wine being inside of the product. So once again, the marketing is actually, it doesn't even make sense, but it unfortunately, the winemakers are appealing to a crowd and to customers who probably have no idea about any type of wine making or wine regions or even wine varietals. So they basically put on the bottle, or I'm sorry, or onto the box, whatever they want. So like you look at the bottom one that says sweet red. Okay, I mean, you guys now know there's different types of varietals and they have completely different flavors and anything like that. And the only thing that it says here is sweet red. So this is something that you might see. Something like Chianti, Chablis, Burgundy. Those are things that are used in these jug wines, but they actually have nothing to do with what's actually inside of the bottle. All right, proprietary labels. Now this one, some of you guys might be familiar with because a lot of you researched the Opus One winery. So this is a great example of something that is a proprietary label. So what this is a wine created by a winery or by a partnership of wineries. And basically what they do is they actually trademark or copyright a specific type of wine that they create. This is fantastic for marketing purposes, and it actually creates this like brand recognition, which in North America is very popular. It's very easy to recognize this wine. It's very easy to create a following. Worthy, which is right, the one of the bottles that's a wine that I absolutely love, and it's very easy to go and ask for it. It's easy to, a lot of times it's easy to pronounce for Americans. And that's actually very important when it comes to putting wines like this on your wine list. So to give you an example, obviously, this is a lot of these proprietary labels. They are typically maritages. So what that means, and we talked about that before, is they're actually blends of specific varietals. So for example, Opus One is actually a blend of Cabernet Sauvignon, Cab Franc, Merlot, Malbec, and Petit Verdot. And those are all, we don't actually have to tell you that. We are just telling you that this is Opus One. We create this meritage, and a lot of people, they will tell you, well, I drink Opus One and I really like it. They won't tell you that they like a meritage of all those different varietals. So it just makes it easier for the winemaker. So these are proprietary labels. And then finally, we do have what's called varietal labels, okay? So these were actually developed or first started by the Vente family in 1936. And this is a way that they wanted to. They were done with those generic labels. They were like, we think that wine drinkers in the US are a little bit more sophisticated, and we think that they would want to know a little bit more exactly what they were drinking and not just make a make-up name or whatever it is. So they started naming the wines they produced according to the varietal. So the type of grape that was used to produce that type of wine. So this is where you see Chardonnay. If we see Chardonnay, we know that the beverage inside of a bottle contains wine made from the Chardonnay grapes. So these are called varietal labels. Okay. Now we have a couple of different things on a wine label that we do also designate in North America. So we do have U.S. legislation states that a wine labeled with a varietal name, it actually must contain 75% of that varietal's juice. So if it says Cabernet Sauvignon, we know it has to be at least 75. Now, some of you might be like, why is it so low? It gives the winery, ability to add other stuff in there. So that could be a little bit tricky. So 25% technically could be something else. Now, other wineries, and especially high-end wineries, they've actually come out and said, well, our wine contains 95% of the varietal. And now if you're a wine drinker and that's what you want, you typically the winery will come out and say that. Oregon, they actually have upped it, and they actually have passed their own state mandate, which demands that 90% of the juice actually has to be of the varietal that's on there. So if it says Pinot Noir and it's coming from Oregon, the customer can know and be assured that it has to be 90% Pinot Noir. So some might argue that actually makes their wine a little bit better. So good job, Oregon, on that. Other things that are located on the actual label that you guys might recognize. You have heard me speak about estate grown and estate bottled. This typically is very important for higher end wines, and for a wine drinker that is looking for something that truly is of the highest quality. I want to make sure that the winemaker has their hands on every aspect of producing this wine. So if I'm buying a wine and I want to make sure that it is the highest quality, I want to know that it's estate grown. That means that the winemaker was in charge of, the growth and the growth process of the wine itself. If it doesn't say estate grown, the winemaker could purchase grapes from anywhere. So they could be, grown in conditions that maybe I don't support. Maybe they weren't sustainable. Maybe they were treated with chemicals. Maybe we don't even know what varietal they are. There's a lot of wineries. Think about these jug wines and box wines again. They buy tons of their grapes from China. They buy tons of their grapes from South Africa. I mean, they're all over. So you literally could have grapes from all over, all different places in one bottle. So if it says estate grown, the term indicates that at least 95% of that grape was grown, harvested under the same winemaker, typically under the same estate. So they're the vineyard. Now, estate bottled, this one's a little even more tricky. This means that the winery itself has a bottling facility on its premise, on the grounds of the winery, and they actually bottle their own wine. Now, this might not be important to some people. There's some smaller wineries that just don't have those facilities on hand, and they actually take their wine and they bottle them at bottling facilities. You have bottling facilities all over winemaking regions, so Napa or anything like that. But this is pretty important because this also takes, that making sure that those hands are, that preciseness and the care is taken by the winemaker. And there's one other thing that you guys might have seen on wines, and that's a term called reserve. And sometimes people are like, oh, it's a reserve. It must be fantastic. Well, reserve actually doesn't have a designation of what it is. Reserve is basically, what that means is that it's something different from what is normally produced. This could be good or bad. This could mean that the wine didn't turn out as the winemaker had intended, so it maybe doesn't taste like previous vintages. So what the winemaker might say is, well, let's call this a reserve. So it's just something a little bit different. So when you see a bottle for $8.99 and it says reserve, I would be a little skeptical. So it could mean something great. It could mean something a little bit different. There are also two other things that we talked about a little bit before. Botrytis, especially, we mentioned in the lecture about Riesling. But there are a couple of things. Late harvest is something that you might find, once again, on a lot of white wines. You typically won't see this that much on red wine, but you might. Late harvest typically means that the grapes were left on a little bit longer, typically on purpose. And a lot of times they actually go through a first frost on the vineyard. And the reason that the winemaker might do this is to create a sweeter wine. So some people, you may have heard of ice wine or something like that, typically, and that is typically a sweeter wine. The other thing, the botrytis, is something that we mentioned last lecture. And this is when the actual grapes themselves, they're actually attacked by a fungus, which is the same botrytis. And you saw, there's a video that I posted about Riesling where the winemakers was separating the Riesling grapes that were not affected by botrytis and ones that they were affected, because you don't want to mix them. And the winemaker would then actually go and make a specific botrytis wine out of those grapes that were affected by the fungus. And they don't make it bad, it's just different. And typically it makes it a little bit sweeter. So this is an example of Sanford. Sanford is an absolutely fantastic vineyard. And they actually produce a botrytis Chardonnay. So if you see that, you know that that means that those grapes have been affected by that fungus. And I would just look at that and understand, yes, that means that the wine will be a little bit sweeter. This gives you an overview about how to read an American, typically used in America, wine label. This is typically if you see a wine coming from South America, Australia, South Africa. They actually follow these rules. They're much easier to understand for an average customer, and that is why they are done as such. So you typically will have a brand name. You might have a special designation. This is the one that we want to pay attention to, right? But if it's a reserve or botrytis, whatever, you might find that in there. You will typically have the vintage, which is the year that the grapes were actually harvested. So when it was actually grown. You might have something that says estate bottled, estate grown, which we just went over. You will typically have the wine type, the varietal that is being used. You might have a name, marketing name, or this is kind of, this might be a combination of a proprietary and a varietal label, but that's something that might be on there. You will definitely have the place of origin, so where it was actually produced. Maybe a vineyard designation, if that is where we know that 95% of the grapes came from that specific vineyard. And you will always have the alcohol by volume. So you will always have that in the North American labels. All right, French labels. Now, you guys don't actually have to know this for the exam, other than the fact that French labels are way more complicated than North American labels, and this takes people study this French designation, and then it goes into Italian designation. They study this for years. So basically, for you to understand the French and the way that they labeled their wine, it doesn't have to do anything with the varietal that you would find inside. It all has to do with where the grapes were grown and where they were bottled. So there you go. You can read all of this about, you can see that something, and it obviously the more specific we get in labeling, in the naming of the actual wine and labels, then the higher quality that the wine actually is. So it can go a large region, and that's where you'd see something like Burgundy, a district, which is this one, a Medoc, or we can go down to a village, and then finally a vineyard. So if you see a specific vineyard on a French label, you can be assured that that is the highest designation of wine and quality. This also gives you kind of an idea about where it goes down and how the French labeling system is done. Once again, it just gives you an idea about the fact how it goes, the larger region, departments, smaller zones. And this is very, very difficult, and I've been learning wine and for a long time, and I still am no expert when it comes to Italian, Spanish, and definitely French labels. But this gives you an overview. For your purposes, make sure that you are understanding of how to read North American labels and the specific things and designations that you might find on each of those. This gives you an idea about the differences about the French label, and it shows you, obviously, there's a lot more that needs to be included on these labels versus North American.